Today's guest is the amazing and fabulous Sarah Friar. I met Sarah when she was in my class a number of years ago, more than either of us want to think about. After that, Sarah went to work at Goldman Sachs. After that, Sarah went to work at a variety of companies, which we're going to talk about. She was CEO of the social networking company Nextdoor, and recently has moved to become the CFO at OpenAI, the enormously well-capitalized and enormously large company in the AI space. And prior to that, she was the CFO of Square. Welcome to Pfeffer on Power, Sarah. Thank you for being with us.
Jeffrey, thank you. It's such a pleasure and honor. I loved your class. I know we're going to talk about that too, but I've always felt very connected to you. And so it's a delight to get to do this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. So, why don't you talk a little bit about your background, how your background even prior to Stanford, and then what you did afterward, so people will have a sense of your career trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pre Stanford, just as a touch point, I was an engineer in undergrad, as you would say, in the U.S. I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I went to Oxford, and I was doing a master's ultimately in material science. I did a pivot because I didn't find tech super welcoming in that particular career path I was going down. Took me to McKinsey. McKinsey brought me to Stanford. And after Stanford, I kind of had realized a couple of things. I really didn't want to be a consultant. I recognized that I'm much more of a practitioner, kind of tend to want to get my hands dirty. I moved to Goldman for reasons that were a little bit more pragmatic. I needed to pay the bills. I was a very broke student, and I needed a visa because I was not an American. So I went to Goldman thinking it'd be a short sojourn, and then I would go back into tech. And I ended up staying there for quite a long time, as you noted, almost 11 years, before I did finally make my way back into the operator role. And then I had to learn the bread and butter of operating. And so I was very lucky to get to work alongside great entrepreneurs like Mark Benioff at Salesforce first, and then moved to Square, where I got to see a startup go from 200 people to 3,500 people, maybe even bigger, take the company public. And I was super happy there in that CFO role because I felt I could really operate and even create products. Nextdoor came calling because of this deep-seated belief I have in community from my upbringing. And then most recently, OpenAI, because it just felt like a place I had to be at, a kind of the crucible of what will be, I think, the biggest change in our lifetime. Not even just with a technology lens, but just to how society operates. And I always want to put myself in a place where I feel like I can have maximum impact, but importantly, the thing I'm impacting will have maximum impact. There's a quote that's always stuck with me. If you want to cause change in the world, give something big a push. And so I often try to put myself in that place.
Okay, that's a great thing. Not every human being is able to make the transition. From Goldman to be a CFO, that kind of makes a lot of sense. But to move from CFO to CEO is not a move that everyone is successful in making. That's number one. And number two, you've already alluded to the issues of women in tech. So can you, for those people who aren't as clever or sophisticated as you are, what permitted you, do you think, to make that move, to get yourself ready in the CFO role and to make you an attractive candidate for a CEO role in technology?
Yeah, I think number one, I mean, coming back to your class a little bit, I mean, first of all, it's just putting yourself in this serendipitous place where your network is working for you. I think one of the things you always emphasized in class was this importance of networking. And for some people, networking can feel really icky. But I grew up, in a very small village in Northern Ireland. My parents are really deeply embedded in that village. And my dad is just one of these consummate, curious people. And so I kind of grew up in this environment where my dad wouldn't even known there was a term called networking, but to him it's just very normal to be curious about people. And he's 87 and he is still like this to this day. So I found myself with both genetically, I have the curiosity gene, but also just it was kind of a way of growing up that actually it's good to be interested in other people. And there's no situation I think you could drop me into where I wouldn't find a way to kind of talk to the people around me, find something interesting, find either points of commonality, points of learning, and with that, have effectively learned to build a network. I'll give you an example. My early days at Goldman. So I joined Goldman in 2000, which is giving away a little bit how long ago it is since I sat in your class. And clearly it was the best of times, and then it very quickly became the worst of times because I was a tech banker. And at one stage, just nothing had happened, right? There was no IPOs going out. That market was frozen. The M&A market was frozen. People were getting fired left, right, and center. Every company was downsizing in tech. And I had started to cover this sector of information security, InfoSec, because the one thing that was happening that was growing were viruses. So NIMDA, Code Red, right? These early cyber attacks. And so I discovered this conference called the RSA Security Conference. It's now huge, like everybody goes. But at the time, it was like you had to find it to know what was going to happen in Moscone Center. And so I decided I would just go to this conference, right? I'm curious, interested. It's a space. I was like, of course, Goldman's going to want me to go here. So I kind of went to this conference. It was 2 days back to back, and I came back to work, and the VP said, "Where have you been? Like, we were a bit worried about you." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I was at this conference." And I walked around this conference, and it was super nerdy. Like, it's the nerds of the nerds. But I was there with my Goldman Sachs business card, and I would just stop at every booth and talk about like what someone's technology was and who they were. And that has paid dividends so long in my career. Number one, it got me into the one space that wasn't cracking when the bubble really burst bad. It got me a pathway over into equity research, which actually became the much longer part of my Goldman career. These people that I met at that stage, many of them were young engineers, have become very senior in the technology industry over time. And it was just such a good learning moment for me. Not just that networking is important, but curiosity is important. That people who don't look like you or seem like you can actually become incredibly important and interesting and useful in your career path. And even to this day, like I don't do anything in cyber today, but it still crops up. I was just, interviewing some folks, and they know folks, and we know folks all because of that. So I think that's a big thing in my career that's allowed me to go from, you kind of asked the question, CFO to CEO. It's because I've let the network work for me. And so often people come to me with really interesting ideas and opportunities. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces of the why.
Okay. And what attempt to, so you were CFO at Square, which had been was a successful company, had gone public. What tempted you to take the job at Nextdoor?
Is a couple of things. I mean, number one, I was incredibly inspired by this focus on community and local community. And that goes back to my Northern Irish roots of why I think community is really important, right? Because I've actually seen the downside, which is when community falls apart,
Yep.
people literally kill each other. So, good reason to make sure it stays somewhat functioning. That was number one. Number two was I actually felt compelled to show that women could become great CEOs of companies and tech companies. And I know that sounds weird, or maybe it doesn't, but
It doesn't actually.
okay, good.
I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, everybody, and you see this for women or underrepresented minorities or immigrants or whatever, and they will say, I want to have a path for more people like me into this space in the world. And if you are going to make a path for more people like you, somebody has to be the first person or one of the early people on that path. And so this makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like you can't be what you can't see. And I felt like I had been standing in front of a lot of women my whole career, at conferences and on panels. And I have a nonprofit called Ladies Who Launch, and it's lots of female entrepreneurs. And I'm always telling them, take the risk, do the thing, create the path. And so it almost felt disingenuous that if that opportunity was in front of me, not to at least give it serious consideration. And I think in the end, when I made the leap, I made it watching the movie The Notorious RBG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and about how she forged a path. And I was feeling almost tearful. And my husband turned to me and said, "You're going to take this role, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I feel like I have to. I feel like I absolutely have to." So that was definitely number two. Number three is commercial. Like, frankly, to this day, I still think Nextdoor is an incredible business opportunity. There's no doubt that when you have incredible data on local, your ability to make great things happen and have a great business model, those two things feel very doable and possible to me. And so I absolutely believed it was a great business idea too.
So when you made the move from CFO to CEO, um, if you can remember or talk about it, what kind of transition or challenges did you face? How did you have to change what you did and how you did it?
Yeah, going from CFO to CEO. I think, number 1 is you really have to lift up. Like, you are truly the owner of the whole business now, not just, your particular domain of expertise. Now, Square absolutely gave me a lot of, learning on this front because one thing about Jack Dorsey as a manager that I've really came to appreciate and continue to appreciate is Jack never put people into slots. Like his view was, it's almost a very first principled view. Like, what are you good at? And his job, my job as a CEO is to put you into a position where if you're good at it, you get to go do it. And that will be to the benefit of growing the whole company. So even as a CFO at Square, I had actually started from scratch two businesses, our lending business, so Square Capital, and then our payroll business, Square Payroll. Now, I did these with amazing teams. This was not like Sarah did not make this whole thing happen, but I got to be part of founding teams. So it's almost a startup within a startup. And so that gave me a lot of experience of what it's like to kind of own the whole thing, not just the slice that has dollars and cents associated with it. And I've always built finance teams where I really push people to say, our job is not to count the beans. We are here to drive insights that ultimately shape the future of this company, maybe even this whole industry. So I think number one, I'd had a much broader experience, which was good. I think second, I've always been, if I think about a place of power for me, has always been I'm good with people. Like I say that with it's hard sometimes. I've learned in my career it's getting easier to say there are things I'm good at, but I am very good with people. And I fundamentally believe that a leader that is great with people, so you get the right, if you get great people right into your company, good things happen. And so I feel like I was already predisposed to get ready for that CEO role by having honed that people leadership and, you know, being able to inspire people. And then I think the third thing, going back to it's kind of a second people piece though, was to make sure I surrounded myself with truth tellers who I trusted, who would also point out when I was, perhaps not reaching as a true CEO, but was falling back into kind of the tactics, the weeds, the places that frankly can be very good for a CFO, because a CFO should be on top of the all the details. But sometimes I can over rotate there, and I need truth tellers who point it out and give me strong feedback when that's happening.
Mm. That all makes sense. I want to talk to you about your move now to the back into a CFO role. I've had a couple of friends who were CEOs who then went to uh, interesting organizations where they were no longer CEO. And I would say and I have another friend, my friend Bruce Kozad, who's the CEO of Jazz Pharmaceutical. And from all three CEOs, Gary Loveman at Caesars, and Amir Rubin at Stanford Healthcare, when they moved out of the CEO role, they found that transition difficult, problematic, that there's something about being a CEO which is fundamentally different than any other role in the organization. You actually already talked about it in terms of, a broader scope and a broader set of responsibilities and whatever that made it, frankly, I think for them difficult to go back. Amir Rubin went to United Healthcare and then went to One Medical, where he was the CEO and basically took the company public and made it extraordinarily successful. Gary went from Caesars to Aetna, where he found that he was not able to do what he wanted to do. And so when CVS bought Aetna, he founded his own startup, which is called Well. So I would love for you to talk about how you thought about becoming a CFO again, and what the transition has felt like for you as you moved out of this enormously broad scope to a different role.
Yeah. Um, so first and foremost, I think it's really about aligning where you can have the most impact, right? The whole, if you're going to change the world, start by giving something big a push.
Okay.
I think second, and so to me that meant OEI or OpenAI right now at this moment in time, I think is at just at the in the crucible of how much AI is going to change the world. And in particular, the mission statement of OpenAI around building technology that will benefit all of humanity was incredibly important to me. Like, we're not just advancing AI, we're actually shaping the future of how society will interact with intelligence itself. And so there's not many places in the world, like it might be an N of one, where I think you can go do that. So, you have to sometimes just recognize that, the role doesn't matter, like the title doesn't matter because the role itself puts you right in that moment. I think the second thing is in a really transformational company as a CFO, you're not just handling numbers, right? It's that push I have to my team that if all we're doing is thinking about dollars and cents or pounds and euros, if we're global, and not thinking about strategy, operations, and people, we are absolutely missing the power of a really strong finance and strategy organization. So one thing I have liked about coming back to being the CFO and not the CEO, one of the things about the CEO role, I did not buy initially this whole thing about it being lonely at the top. And I definitely came to realize over my 5.5 years at Nextdoor, and by the way, I kind of lived them at extraordinary times, right? We lived COVID, we lived the kind of Black Lives Matter movement, we lived the return to office. Like, there was just a lot of things that were not in the normal CEO playbook. But I realized how much I was kind of, on the one hand, I was the person that was liaising with the board, and on the other hand, I was the person that had to liaise to my executive team and then down to the whole company. And that in that kind of teeter-totter in the middle, you were a role of one. And that actually was quite lonely and stressful and pressureful. And often when it would come to, it's going to sound a little trite, when it would come to just fun stuff, like if the company was celebrating, like when Nextdoor went public, right? Every team, every leader, the CFO, the finance org was celebrating, and the go-to-market org was celebrating, and the product org was celebrating, and their leaders were with them. And I literally felt homeless. I was like, because if I go to one, I show preference, like I have a favored child. And sometimes it's impossible to go to all. And so sometimes you end up in this moment where you go to none. And I was like, gosh, I don't have a home. It's kind of actually lonely. The nice thing about being back in the CFO role is I have a band of peers. I have a boss. Sam is my boss. And I know how much he wants it to be a band of peers, but I also understand how hard that can be for him. But I get to kind of take all that kind of backpack off and be like, I now have a band of peers to talk to, and I don't have to always just be strong in the moment. I can actually be more vulnerable because there's a bit more of a level set here. Does that
No,
make sense?
yeah, it makes complete sense. I think it's a very good answer. If you said to me, I love being part of a team, I understand that. I think many people who play on sports teams love being part of a team. But sometimes when you're part of a team, the team dynamics can be themselves interesting and somewhat problematic. What have you done to make sure that the team that you're part of is a well-functioning rather than a non-well-functioning team? And that would be true for your role at Nextdoor as well, because there's a lot of talk about team, but oftentimes there are rivalries and there are disagreements that aren't managed very well. I mean, not just at OpenAI or whatever, but you see this in lots of companies.
Mhm. Yeah, and I will fully say I am about 9 weeks into OpenAI, so there's still work to be done to make sure we all function together as a team, and our culture is constantly evolving because of the pace at which we're running at. But I think the first step of getting to any team is you have to understand, right? You have to listen and just have a sense of like, what is the culture of this organization, or what is this team all about? And then also when companies are moving fast, you just have to dive in and get work done because there's just stuff needs to be done right now that's really, really important. But in the listening mode, I've probably done about 80 one-on-ones at this stage, 30-minute one-on-ones, and I start them all by saying, "Hey, no agenda for this meeting. I literally just want to know who you are. Like, where'd you come from? Like, where'd you grow up? What university did you go to if you went to university? Where did you work before? What do you do here?" That's like number one. Number two is like, what's the most important thing you're working on that I need to know about? And number three is, where are you blocked? Because my job is to accelerate you. And it is fascinating when you get 70 or 80 people to answer that question. You start to really get this magical feel of what's this culture here. And I think what's very different about OpenAI is that we are a research driven culture, right? The company started, it wasn't a company, it was actually more of a research lab. And that is still at the core. Like if you peel the onion, right at the very core is this amazing group of researchers. And even their work environment is very collaborative. There's a library. People just like sit on. It feels like being in a university. My daughter is about to go into sophomore year. She spent all summer working in a lab at her university, and going into her lab, there's a lot of echoes in my life at the moment. I go to visit her, and then I come back to work, and I'm like, oh, there's a lot of things that feel really the same here. So I think understanding that culture is first and foremost, and then coming together with my peer group, for example, and saying, okay, when we want to discuss things that feel more businessy, like what's our what's our performance management process or what's our compensation process, you can then link back and forth to say, okay, if a research culture can be about excellence, like people literally want to be the best in their field, but it's also highly collaborative. So if you were doing, say, performance management, everybody wants an AA plus because they are probably, but you can't give everyone an A, and then if you start gradating people, you might actually break the collaboration. And so this is where, like, I think it's important to understand the culture, understand what you're trying to get to, and then build a company around it that meets those things. So I think you actually become a team when you work through challenges and hard things, almost more so than when you work through the easy things. But when you work through those hard things, learning to then also have the team peel back and say, job well done, people. Like, we should feel great. Like that, I think, is a role that I can often fulfill. And, the good thing, bad thing about being at a place like OpenAI is that things that I think would normally take like a year plus to happen inside most companies seem to happen within about a week in this place. And so the ability to do this cycle that I just talked about quickly is very much upon me right now. And I think that's a big part of how you build the connective tissue of an executive team down into like the rest of the team.
Yeah. It's a great answer. Um, so I will end the thing by the podcast by asking you to think about, if you can go back that far in time, to the lessons from my class. As you reflect on the class, what have been the lessons that you think you've applied or been the most useful to you as you've gone on into your career? You've mentioned one, kind of the networking, but beyond that, anything else that comes to your mind?
There's definitely a lot. And every once in a while, either pull one of your books off the shelf or now that the world of podcasts exists, listen in. Um, I One of the most enduring lessons from your class for me was the importance of owning your power. And that concept has stayed with me throughout my career. Because as a woman in tech, or woman generally speaking in the business world, often you are both, I think, brought up to not own your power, to kind of almost shield your power. And even in a business context, in a tech context, it can really actually surprise people when you make a more power mode move. And it's from little things like I think generally speaking, people would describe me as relatively nice and collegiate and all those things. So actually getting angry is a power move for me because it's very, very unexpected. So people know that when I've gotten to that point where I'm actually willing to be very angry in front of them, that, something bad is happening and we better make this right, but it's a power move. So that's an example, I think, of owning my power. Um, I also think that, getting out of my own way was an idea that really resonated. Being willing to step up even when I don't feel perfectly prepared. A good example is doing a podcast like this. You want everything to be perfect. You've thought through all the smart things that you might say. And then I think historically that might have been something that held me back from doing things, because I definitely am someone who was brought up with perfection being a goal. And as I've gotten much more senior in my career, I've recognized, first of all, just how much that holds people back. I think it particularly holds women back, but I think about it regularly. Like, am I not doing this thing because, people often say it's because of fear or lack of taking risks, but I actually think for me, it's a perfection gene. So trying not to hold myself back. And then I think the final thing I would say is, just more recently, as I've listened to more of your pieces again, or even when we had our dinner together, the kind of, what is your power brand? You had like a wonderful moment in a podcast where you were talking about a female VC in the Valley, kind of very tall Asian woman. And you talked about the fact that even like her fashion statements were part of her brand.
Absolutely.
And I think for women, like the idea that how you look, it's often you try to downplay it. Like if you look at like people in tech, not even just gender, but like everyone's got, they don't think it's a uniform, but they have their jeans and their hoodie and their running shoes. And most people take pride in the I rolled out of bed look because it's very tech. That's not me. I like always wear my high heels. I love being tall. I remember one of your pictures in about showing LBJ leaning over the top of someone. And so I think a lot about my height and the fact that I am a tall woman. I think about my brand being usually looking relatively polished, like I'm on it. And I think about even sometimes saying my brand out loud when I first meet with someone. Like, my brand is I am a straight shooter. You will always hear from Sarah exactly what's going on and why she's not playing games with you. And so I actually even say that sometimes the first time I meet with someone, particularly if I know I'm going to end up negotiating with them down the line, because I actually think by laying the imprint of what your brand is, you almost will it into being. Now, you have to keep walking the talk and not just talking the talk, but you get people very fast to what's the brand of this person. And hence, I view that almost as a power move too. So I'll pause there, but there was a lot I took away and a lot of that I use in my day-to-day.
Well, I love the examples. And by the way, it's not just for women. People comment that when Donald Trump does an event, that he wears kind of this outfit that has become quite routinized for him, with the red tie and the blue suit and the lapel pin and all this other stuff. So, and I know men who've been concerned about this. A friend of mine once said, if I go to give a talk, she said, you ought to be dressed one level better than the audience. And so, I think, I think appearance matters, and it's interesting that you would talk about it. So we've had a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you for being on this podcast. Today we have been talking to the fabulously interesting and amazing and thoughtful and intelligent Sarah Friar.
Thanks, Jeffrey.